Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm Steven, Northwest Small Batch Brewing, and today is another Brew Talk. So today's Brew Talk harkens back to some of the beginnings of my channel. One of the first videos I ever made had to do with grain and mashing and all that sort of thing. But I wanted to do a review, like a summary, because that video was very long and it's, although accurate, I think I can add some newer information. And make sure you stick around to the end. I've got a couple of tips when it comes to mashing and efficiency that you may or may not have thought of. So let's start off. I want everybody on the same, grounds here. So I apologize if you already know this information, but for those who don't, I'm going to start from the beginning and build, right? So start with, you have your barley, right? Your grain. Barley, by the way, is literally the seeds of a grass. That's how you're making your beer. You're making your beer from grass seed. So you take the seeds, and inside the seeds are a little bit of starch. And so that is the building blocks of life. And so what malting companies do is they will dampen the seeds and heat them a little bit, and it will basically trick the seeds into germinating, and so they will start to sprout eventually a little branch, basically, without any leaves, just a little branch. And that branch, because it has no leaves, cannot do photosynthesis yet to generate its own food, so it needs a food source to get started. And so to do that, it creates an enzyme that will convert that little bit of starch that's in the seed into sugar, which it can then eat as its initial food until it can start to grow leaves and create its own food through photosynthesis. So what we're doing, what malt companies are doing, is they are forcing that process, and then as soon as that little sprout comes out, they're immediately drying that seed so that you can trap the enzyme and the starch, so that when we mill the grain and we're releasing all the starch, it has the enzyme to convert that starch into the sugar that our yeast needs in order to make alcohol. That's the real huge overview, not super detailed, of basically how all that works. So the point I'm getting to is the mash matters. A lot of people say they can't hit their original gravity, or their final gravity of the final beer is not, it like stalls, it doesn't go far enough, right? I have an issue right now with the beer doing that. So a lot of that can have to do with the mash, and that's what I want to really get to here. So initially, there's several different enzymes going on here in the mash that affect it at different temperatures, right? So you have beta glucanase, which is going to happen at the lower end, like around 100, let's say 113 degrees or so. And all that's doing is basically turning the long chain sugars into short chain sugars, which makes, of course, it easier for yeast and whatnot to eat that kind of sugar, right? As you start heating and warming up the mash higher, you get to beta amylase. Now, I don't want to give you a range here, so I'm just going to say that beta amylase ends at 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you are mashing 150 degrees or less, you're getting this beta amylase, which will create maltose, which is 100% fermentable sugar. Now, as you start to raise the temperature up, you're going to get alpha amylase. Somewhere around 154 degrees, I think, is when you're going to start getting the alpha amylase, which actually still produces maltose, but it also produces these unfermentable sugars that the yeast can't eat. And so if you mash at a higher temperature, let's just say you're mashing at 155, you're mostly getting alpha amylase. Your final gravity is going to be higher and have more unfermentable sugars and have sweeter beer, more malty, what they would call more body into the beer, right? But it may irritate you because it seems like your yeast is not getting to the gravity that you want it to, that final gravity. And that may be because you mash at too high a temperature and there's sugars that the yeast just can't eat, right? On the other spectrum, you have the beta amylase. So if you're mashing at a lower temperature, let's say 150 degrees, you're going to get more of the fermentable sugars, which means the yeast can eat through more of it, and you're more likely to get a drier beer with less of that sweetness and maltiness, and it'll be thinner and have less body. So normally you want a happy medium. So I would say 152, you could say 153 is kind of right in the middle. It's like this zone where you're going to get both beta and alpha amylase together and get a little bit of both, right? But you have to play with that. Depending on what style of beer you're making, you may want it drier or sweeter, so you need to adjust your mash temperature on that. So if you're not hitting the final gravity that you want to on your beers, check your mash temperature and start making some adjustments. Lower your mash temperature, not significantly, but just a little bit each time to see if you start getting, closer to that final gravity that you're hoping for. So I had 2 tips for you. Here's the first one. If you're making a smaller batch, like I brew 3-gallon batches normally because 5 is just too much for one person, in my opinion. At least for me, it's too much to get through in a month. So I do 3-gallon batches. But if you're using an electric system like I do, and not everybody is, but if you are, you should look into making an adjustment on your controller. I've found that if you have your controller at 100% power, and this is especially true of a 240 volt controller, but I found it to be true of the 110 one as well. If you are mashing a smaller mash, so if you're not doing a 5-gallon batch, so let's say you're doing a 3-gallon like me, you want to lower the power, right? So lower it down to like 80% power and see how that works for you during your mash. Otherwise, what's going to happen is when you go to mash, it's going to way overshoot because it's got too much power. So when it goes to heat your mash up to the mash temperature, it can't stop in time. It's too hot. It's got too much power going through it. You're going to way overshoot, and it's going to take a long time to come back down, and then it's going to turn back on and way overshoot again. So turn the power down on your controller. Try, like I said, 80% and see if that helps when you're doing a smaller batch like that. That's the first tip. And you'll probably see that creeping up in my Hot Tip Thursday shorts pretty soon. Also, the second tip I have, there is a process that people used to do called doughing in and then a dough rest. It's not really done that much anymore. I'm going to do it on my next brew that I do just to throw it in there. But it can actually give you a couple of extra percentage points on your efficiency. So the way it works is you dough in, meaning you toss in all your grain at around 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you let it just sit there for about 20 minutes. That's the rest. That's your dough in rest. All that's doing, if you ever mashed, when you mash in, it's kind of like cement when you're trying to mix it at first. The starch has not started to convert yet. It's kind of like difficult to get it to mix, especially with a big, grain bill. If you give it 20 minutes at that lower temperature, it will start the process to break down the starch. It'll start getting watery. You can mix it better. Give it a little bit of time, then bump it up to your normal mash temperature that you want to mash at, and it should give you a little extra efficiency out of your beer. So if you have any efficiency issues, that's a little trick. It won't fix everything, but it'll give you a little nudge, little nudge. Anyway, that's all I have. I'm out of time. I thought that would be interesting to talk about, and hopefully those tips help. I'll be back in another week with another video, and until then, keep on brewing.